What if everything you learned about colonialism in school was incomplete? What if it wasn't about discovery, progress, or civilization, but about control, profit, and violence? Millions were taught to see empires as builders, not destroyers. Railways, schools, and laws were praised, while famine, slavery, and mass death were erased. This isn't the history you were taught. This is the history you were never meant to question. They told you colonialism was about discovery. They told you it was about trade, progress, civilization. They told you it brought roads, railways, schools, and law. What they didn't tell you is that colonialism was one of the most violent, calculated systems of exploitation in human history. From classrooms to textbooks, colonialism is often presented as a chapter, something that began, ended, and moved on, a temporary phase, a necessary step toward modernity. But this version of history is not just incomplete, it is deliberately softened. Because if colonialism were taught honestly, it would force uncomfortable questions. Questions about power, about wealth, about who benefited and who paid the price. Colonialism was not an accident. It was not curiosity. It was not destiny. It was a business model. Empires didn't expand because they wanted to share culture. They expanded because land meant resources, and resources meant profit. Gold, silver, spices, cotton, rubber, oil, sugar. Entire continents were reduced to inventories. And the people living there? They became labor. Schools rarely explain this clearly. Instead, colonialism is framed as something that happened, rather than something that was done, intentionally, violently, and repeatedly. Maps are shown changing colors, dates are memorized, names of explorers are celebrated, but the screams are missing. The chains are missing. The villages burned to the ground are missing. Colonialism didn't just redraw borders, it shattered societies, erased cultures, and rewired entire economies to serve distant capitals thousands of miles away. And the effects didn't disappear when the flags came down. They're still here, still shaping global inequality, still determining which countries are rich and which are labeled developing, still influencing whose lives are considered valuable and whose suffering is ignored. But to understand that, we have to unlearn what school taught us and start with what colonialism really was. Not a mission, not a mistake, but a system built on control. And it begins with how empires justified doing the unthinkable. How empires made violence look moral. No empire ever said, "We are here to steal." They couldn't, because even violence needs a story to survive. So colonial powers invented one. They called it a mission, a duty, a burden. They claimed they were bringing light to darkness, order to chaos, civilization to savagery. This wasn't just propaganda for the public back home. It was a psychological shield, a way to commit atrocities without seeing themselves as villains. Religion was one of the first tools. Colonial expansion was often framed as a holy endeavor. Lands were described as godless. Peoples were labeled heathens. Conversion became a justification for conquest. If entire civilizations could be reduced to souls to be saved, then violence became mercy. Destruction became charity. But when religion alone wasn't enough, science was recruited. In the 18th and 19th centuries,
Empires embraced racial theories that ranked humanity itself. Pseudoscience claimed Europeans were biologically superior, more evolved, more intelligent. These ideas were taught as fact, printed in books, presented in lectures, used to argue that colonized people were naturally suited for labor, discipline, and rule. Once you convince yourself someone is less human, exploitation becomes easy. Colonial officials didn't see themselves as tyrants. They saw themselves as managers, administrators of inferior societies. Their brutality was reframed as discipline, their theft as efficiency. Even education became a weapon. Schools were established not to empower local populations, but to train a small elite who could serve colonial administration. Local histories were erased. Indigenous languages were suppressed. Children were taught to admire the empire that controlled them, to see their own cultures as backward, shameful, obsolete. This wasn't accidental. When people forget who they are easier to rule. Colonial law followed the same logic. Laws weren't designed for justice, they were designed for control. Colonizers lived under one legal system, the colonized under another. Punishments were harsher, rights were limited. Entire populations could be imprisoned, displaced, or executed without trial. And yet, all of this was presented as order, progress, stability. What schools often fail to explain is that colonialism required constant violence to survive. It wasn't peaceful governance, it was ongoing coercion. Uprisings were not rare exceptions, they were inevitable reactions. And when resistance happened, the response was swift and merciless. Villages were burned as warnings, crops destroyed to cause famine, leaders publicly executed to break morale. These acts weren't rogue decisions, they were policy. Still, back in Europe, newspapers spoke of development, politicians spoke of responsibility, textbooks spoke of advancement. The lie worked because it was repeated everywhere. And it worked so well that even today, many people struggle to see colonialism as evil because it was never taught as such. But beneath the language of morality was a simple truth. Empires needed resources. Resources required land. Land required control. And control required violence. Everything else was just a story told to make that violence feel justified. And once violence became normal, the extraction could begin. The great looting of the world. Colonialism didn't make empires rich by accident. It made them rich by design. Behind every grand museum, every industrial revolution, every golden age celebrated in textbooks, there was a steady river of wealth flowing outward, from colonized lands to imperial capitals. This wasn't trade between equals, it was extraction. Entire economies were reorganized to serve one purpose, feeding the empire. Colonized regions were forced to abandon self-sufficiency and focus on a narrow set of export crops or raw materials. Food systems that had sustained communities for centuries were dismantled. Land that once produced nourishment now produced profit. And when people resisted, they were punished. Farmers were compelled to grow cash crops instead of food. If they refused, taxes were imposed, taxes that could only be paid in colonial currency. To earn that currency, people had to work for the colonizers. This wasn't free labor, it was coerced dependence. Schools rarely explain this mechanism, but it was devastating. Millions starved not because food didn't exist, but because food was exported. Famines swept through colonized regions with horrifying regularity. These weren't natural disasters, they were man-made. Crops were shipped abroad, while local populations died beside full warehouses. Colonial authorities knew, they documented it, and they continued anyway. Meanwhile, natural resources were stripped at an industrial scale. Forests were cut down, mines were dug deep into the earth, rivers were redirected, rubber, diamonds, gold, copper, oil, resources extracted not to develop local infrastructure, but to fuel factories thousands of miles away. The wealth generated didn't stay. Railways were built, yes, but not to connect communities. They connected mines to ports. Roads didn't link villages to hospitals. They linked plantations to shipping routes. Infrastructure existed to move resources out, not to improve life within. This is why the argument that colonialism built development falls apart under scrutiny. Development for whom? Colonialism also looted culture. Artifacts, manuscripts, sacred objects, even human remains were taken and displayed as trophies. Civilizations were treated like excavation sites. What couldn't be carried away was often destroyed. Temples torn down, libraries burned, histories erased. The theft was so extensive that many modern museums are filled almost entirely with objects taken during colonial rule. And yet, the narrative taught in schools focuses on the rise of empires, not the collapse of societies that funded them. We learn about industrialization without asking where the raw materials came from. We celebrate economic growth without tracing the bloodlines of the wealth. Colonialism didn't just exploit land, it rewired global economics. It created a world where some countries exported cheap raw materials, while others controlled manufacturing, finance, and trade. A world where wealth accumulated in a few centers, while the rest were locked into dependency. And when colonialism officially ended, this structure didn't disappear, it remained. Former colonies were left with economies designed to serve others, borders drawn without regard for culture or history, and governments weakened by decades of divide and rule tactics. Independence arrived, but without power. And the consequences of that imbalance would shape the next century. Because when empires left, they didn't leave equality behind. They left scars. How colonialism broke societies from the inside. Colonialism didn't just take land and resources, it reshaped how people saw themselves and each other. One of the most damaging legacies schools rarely discuss is how empires ruled by division. Colonial powers quickly learned that controlling millions of people with a small foreign population required strategy. Force alone wasn't enough, so they turned communities against themselves. Ethnic differences that had once been fluid were hardened into rigid identities. Groups that had coexisted, traded, and intermarried were suddenly classified, ranked, and labeled. Some were favored with education, jobs, or political power. Others were deliberately marginalized. This wasn't coincidence, it was policy. By rewarding loyalty and punishing resistance, colonial administrations created artificial hierarchies. These divisions made unified rebellion harder and colonial rule easier. But the cost was enormous and permanent. Long after independence, these manufactured divisions exploded into conflict. Civil wars, genocides, and political instability didn't emerge from nowhere. They were fueled by borders and identities designed in colonial offices, not by the people who lived there. Colonialism also dismantled traditional systems of governance. Before empire, many societies had complex political structures, councils, elders, federations, legal systems rooted in custom and consensus. Colonial rulers dismissed these as primitive and replaced them with centralized authority that answered only to the empire. Power was no longer accountable to the people. It was enforced from above. Local leaders were either removed or turned into intermediaries, stripped of legitimacy and forced to enforce colonial demands. This broke trust between rulers and communities, a fracture that still haunts many post-colonial states. Culture was another casualty. Languages were suppressed in favor of the colonizer's tongue. Speaking your native language could mean punishment, humiliation, or exclusion from opportunity. Over time, entire generations grew up believing their own cultures were obstacles to success. When a people are taught to feel inferior, control becomes internal. Colonial education rarely encouraged critical thinking or innovation. It trained obedience, memorization, respect for authority. Creativity that challenged the system was discouraged. The goal was not empowerment, it was compliance. Even family structures were altered. Men were forced into labor far from home. Women carried the burden of survival under impossible conditions. Children grew up disconnected from tradition, history, and identity. Social cohesion weakened under constant pressure. Schools often teach colonial resistance as brief revolts, isolated uprisings quickly crushed by superior power. What they don't teach is the daily resistance, refusing to forget language, secretly teaching history, practicing forbidden rituals, preserving memory in stories passed down quietly. Colonialism tried to erase identity. It failed, but not without damage. The psychological impact was profound. Generations grew up measuring themselves against foreign standards, believing progress meant imitation, not self-determination. Even today, traces remain in beauty standards, governance models, education systems, and economic priorities. This is why colonialism cannot be understood only as a past event. It invaded minds as much as territories. And when independence finally arrived, many nations discovered something cruel. The empire had left, but the structure of control remained, just without the colonizer's flag. Which raises an uncomfortable question schools often avoid. If colonialism ended, why do its effects feel so alive?
Colonialism didn't end, it evolved. School taught you that colonialism ended with independence. Flags were lowered, new flags were raised, speeches were made. The story, according to textbooks, reached its conclusion. But history didn't stop there. Because colonialism didn't disappear, it changed shape. When direct rule became too costly, empires found subtler ways to maintain control. Political independence arrived without economic freedom. Former colonies inherited economies designed for extraction, not growth. They produced raw materials, but depended on others to process, finance, and sell them. Debt replaced chains. International loans came with conditions. Trade agreements favored powerful nations. Local industries struggled to compete against global corporations backed by centuries of accumulated wealth built, in part, from colonial extraction. This is why many countries rich in resources remain poor in outcomes, not because of laziness, not because of incompetence, but because they entered the modern world already disadvantaged. Schools often emphasize corruption and poor governance in post-colonial states without explaining how colonialism actively created weak institutions, divided societies, and artificial borders. Blame is placed on the victim, not the system that shaped the outcome. Even knowledge itself remains unequal.
Whose history is considered world history? Whose philosophers are taught? Whose tragedies are remembered? Colonial narratives still dominate global memory. Empires are discussed in terms of legacy and influence, while the suffering they caused is minimized, debated, or dismissed as complicated. But complexity should never be used to excuse injustice. Understanding colonialism honestly is not about guilt, it's about clarity. It's about recognizing that the modern world was built unevenly, and that inequality didn't happen by chance. When people say, "that was a long time ago," they ignore how systems outlive the people who create them. Wealth accumulates, power compounds, trauma passes through generations. Colonialism shaped borders, economies, identities, and global hierarchies that still define everyday life, from migration patterns to global poverty, from cultural confidence to political instability. And yet, despite everything, colonized peoples survived. They preserved language under punishment. They protected culture under threat. They resisted erasure when erasure was policy. That survival is rarely centered in classrooms. But it should be, because history is not just about what was taken, it's also about what endured. Learning the truth about colonialism doesn't weaken the present, it strengthens it. It allows us to see the world as it is, not as it was sold to us. It challenges comfortable myths and replaces them with responsibility. Not responsibility to feel shame, but responsibility to understand. Because the moment you see colonialism clearly, you stop asking why some nations struggle and start asking who benefited from that struggle. And once you ask that question honestly, history stops being a story about the past. It becomes a mirror that shows how the world was built and how it might finally be rebuilt differently if we're brave enough to face the truth school never told us.